All right, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to SaberSim's DFS Office Hours. It is Tuesday, February 22nd of 2022. The extremely rare, I was going to say the rare, extremely rare 2/22/22 day here. We are 2 days away from finally having basketball back here, and we've got some good questions in our queue here for today. So we'll kick things off. We'll talk in a second here a little bit about core plays, and actually, I guess specifically why SaberSim doesn't have core plays or anything like that. I think it's an interesting question every time that comes up, so I want to talk a little bit about that. I'll walk through my golf process, and I guess especially talk a little bit about some things that I'm doing a little bit differently or have changed in particular for this season, and really in particular things that have maybe changed for me since our last golf videos that we've put out up on YouTube. We'll talk a little bit about maximum exposure here, especially in higher variance sports. Great question there. And then it looks like there's a couple questions here about value, the value calculation, how to use the value column, and then also maybe a little bit of a deep dive into Thursday's NBA slate. So we'll go ahead. We'll start slowly just getting into things here, but let's get the app pulled up and jump into our first question. So this one came in from Brett, and we'll start here. And first of all, welcome, Brett. I noticed you mentioned that you said you had just signed up, so welcome. And Brett said, are there core picks from coaches for lineup adjustments for max GPP? And there aren't. I think many of you that watch this show regularly or have been with SaberSim for some time know that, but we don't do core plays. We don't really... I don't, and none of the other folks at SaberSim really give out our favorite plays of the slate. And there's a couple reasons for that. I think one of the main reasons is that we want you guys to feel empowered to kind of come up with that for yourself with the support of the simulations. And that information is pretty readily available in the app. And we'll talk about, how you can kind of come up with what those cores look like or the different strategies you can use to come up with that. But also in particular, because I think the idea of core plays can be a little bit, I would say slightly misleading based on the sport and the contest that you are playing in. The plays that are good plays, right? The core plays or the plays that you would want to be the highest exposed to are going to vary pretty significantly between a potentially a single entry tournament in NBA with 500 people versus a golf tournament that is a 150 max with 100,000 lineups in it, right? And we can see that just with our sliders alone, even within a single sport. The strategies overall that we would use to be successful in a small field single entry are going to vary pretty heavily than the strategies we would use for a 150 max tournament, for example. Now, a lot of the plays can still be good plays between both of those different tournament types, right? But the exposure that you would have to different players, maybe potentially some of those plays themselves would be different between those tournaments. So if you are interested overall in just getting an idea of what we think are good plays for a particular slate, we recommend starting with a test build. And what that means is go to the sport that you are planning on playing here, right? In this case, maybe NBA, DraftKings, maybe you're playing the 20 max. And when we say run a test build, we just mean run a build without changing any of the settings here and seeing what kind of players you're getting exposure to. And this is going to say, based on the settings, the strategies that we think are optimal for this sport and site and slate size and contest size, these are the best plays. So I'm curious. Let's just see what this looks like. So there you have it, right? And you'll often see a lot of times too, there is kind of a core, sometimes on some slates more than others, but you kind of do see a core get established here. And you can even kind of just see the spectrum of core plays, right? Like there's clearly one kind of must-have player for this particular contest type where the projections are right now, and that's Cameron Payne with Chris Paul out. But then you can kind of see, we've got some Denver value here against Sacramento, right? Fast-paced game. Some of these other plays here. And this would vary if we run here now a 150 max, right? Let's run 150 lineups on the 150 max sliders. We'll see probably something a little bit different here. Probably some similar names at top, but different exposure to those plays and different maybe some other lower owned plays popping up here on a bigger tournament too. Let's see. So yeah, I mean, Cameron Payne's exposure comes down a little bit here. We're just a little bit over double the field now here. Some similar names for the most part, but maybe some lower owned plays starting to pop up here a little bit too. So that's kind of our stance overall on the cores, right? Is that it's very contest dependent, right? Your exposure to different players is going to vary pretty heavily depending on what you're playing. And the best way to figure out what our favorite plays are for a particular slate and for a particular contest is to just run the test build for yourself. So, cool. Great. Let's keep it going. All right. And this is a question from Amato N here. About golf strategy. He says, could you please show us your process in building lineups for PGA? In a previous video, you showed limiting the player pool in step 1 by their top 20/make cut. In step 2, would you change the max exposure to get as many players into your lineups as possible? So let's bounce over to the golf side of things. So before we get into this in detail, a couple notes. I think my overall, actually here, hang on, let me do this. Let me, one sec. Getting signed into different account here. Okay, cool. Okay, hang on. Sorry about that. One sec. Okay. So my overall approach to golf strategy, golf DFS strategy, is going to be a very, I would say it's an ownership-focused approach. And I think golf DFS in general is a sport where there is a little bit of a lower edge. There is no real correlation unless you get very fortunate with weather correlation. The Vegas odds and therefore the player salaries and generally the ownership in the sport is pretty sharp. So the edges can be a little bit smaller. So the things that I'm doing in particular to get a little bit of an edge when I play golf DFS is to figure out where there might be ownership inefficiencies and push those ownership inefficiencies, and overall to just try to make sure that I'm building lineups that have some raw upside, that have lineup constructions that have a fair shot at winning something. So when I am doing my research for golf, the main thing I'm mostly focused on is making sure that the ownership projections are dialed in, that I feel confident about where they are landing. And I think overall, the ownership projections on SaberSim are pretty good. The problem is that because this is an algorithmic model that determines these ownership projections, I think sometimes they don't do a very good job of kind of picking up steam. And there's a lot of steam overall over the course of a week as we prepare for a given golf tournament. What I mean by that is that there will be golfers that, because of, I guess, some of the main things that I look at are because of recent form or the perception of course history or course fit. And I actually think one of the things that Max always mentions here is youth. Those kinds of things can sometimes lead to golfers getting a little bit more steamed, a little bit higher ownership than I think they should get otherwise, right? So I use these as kind of a baseline, as almost, I want to say, almost efficient ownership of where these guys maybe should be, right? And I will make adjustments to the ownership projections based on what I am seeing. So again, just thinking through each of these things, the very first thing I will do to get familiar with the week is I will pull up, I like to use Action Network or just any of the sports books that you might have, right? I will get an idea of what just like the raw outright odds are for that particular week as a way to get familiarized. And one of the names that I actually saw as I was prepping for this was Sungjae, who I think is actually probably going to be one of the more chalky golfers in the 10K range. And I'm not going to go through and walk through like my exact prep for what I would do for every single golfer for this particular event, but these are the kind of things that I'm starting to look at. And a lot of times what I'll do is I will actually pull up a little bit. I will pull up like a little notepad. Let me see if I can pull this up here. And just start to take some notes. And I'm basically looking for golfers that kind of check multiple boxes here of potentially giving me a reason to think that they might be getting some more ownership than expected. So what I will do is pull this up here. Okay. So let's do this. So this is just with my odds research, right? And I will just start writing down names that are kind of jumping out to me that I think are going to be kind of popular. So that's a good example there. And then what I will do here is I will open up Data Golf. This is another site I like to use a lot here, especially to look at course fit and course history. And again, I'm not so much looking at these things because I want to make adjustments to projections necessarily. I am looking to see if there is going to be golfers that are going to be more popular because of a perception of their history or fit for the course. So let's start with history. So you can go in here. I like their course history tools quite a bit. And the one thing I like to do is contextualize this by seeing how much they say the course history is important for this particular course. And you can see for the PGA National, right, for the course this week, it is about maybe kind of a middle of the road, maybe a little bit more on the predictive side, right? So course history can be useful here, but the biggest adjustments that they're making to any of their golfers here in their predictions is about maybe a combination of performance and experience of maybe a little over a quarter of a stroke gain per round, right? So I think that kind of helps to set the stage that even for the golfers where this makes the biggest impact, we're only talking about a quarter to a third of a stroke gained per round. So what I like to start doing here is to play around with this. And I think this can just be an interesting thing to explore and see how you want to use this and see if there's any reason to believe that maybe for a different golfer, this is getting overrated. So I will look, one of the first things I do is look at the true strokes gained, right? Actually, either of these work fine. The true strokes gained that the golfer gained on the particular course or what versus the data golf expectation. But I think what you can do is by sorting these, you can kind of see who are golfers that have succeeded recently at this course. And again, I start to kind of build a case here of what do I think are going to be the golfers that are going to be popular here, right? Tommy Fleetwood, Sung Jae comes up again. Daniel Berger pops up. Aaron Wise, right? These are all golfers that I was kind of seeing as I was researching the ownership on SaberSim that we are kind of seeing similar stories here. So I'll start to take some notes here, right? So again, we saw Sung Jae, we saw Tommy Fleetwood. Daniel Berger popped up, right? I'm generally focused on some of the bigger names here, right? Because these are the guys that are actually going to get typically enough ownership, enough steam in their actual ownership projections that it actually, there's an edge that can be pushed there, right? Like it's certainly interesting, I guess, here that, Kramer Hickok and Chase Seifert and guys like this, I guess, also have a decent course history, but those ownership projections for those value plays, those low salary guys never really get that out of control. I'm looking for ownership from the standpoint of where's ownership inefficient, where is there an edge that can be pushed, and a lot of times that's on the higher salary guys. So we'll take some notes there, and then I will jump over to Course Fit, and their Course Fit tool is also under this interactives thing, Course Fit. And I think this tool is also pretty cool. It will, in general, just show you what are the most important stats for this particular golf course. But again, I'm coming at this less from the standpoint of what are the golfers I want to play. I'm looking to see if there are going to be components of a golfer's game that maybe will get overinflated, right? Or will there be a certain reason that a golfer starts getting more popular because of the perception of a course fit? Because again, here's another good example, right? On PGA National, The biggest adjustment based on course fit for this particular course is 0.16 of a stroke per round, right? This is not an enormous factor, right? That probably adds up to maybe a point and a half over the course on a projection over the course of the whole tournament. So I'm looking here to see, are there any golfers that are, maybe more popular guys that might be getting steamed because of their perceived course fit? And I actually don't think this is a great week for that. I don't think there are a lot of those guys. I'll also look the opposite here and see if there's a name of a bigger name golfer that maybe has a perception of not being a very good course fit. It's interesting that Daniel Berger's name is coming up here because I think he's actually going to be pretty chalky. But there are certain times where maybe a higher salary guy that doesn't fit the course based on that golfer's profile will actually end up getting lower ownership because they are perceived to not fit the course very well. I actually will typically check that for course history too. I like to see, is there a golfer that maybe hasn't had as much success on the course, especially a higher salary guy on maybe a smaller sample size of rounds here that I can take advantage of. And there's not really that exact situation here either. The one other thing to note here, since we're back here, the one thing that popped out to me when I was researching this, and I should have mentioned it beforehand, is, again, you see a much higher than expected performance from Tommy Fleetwood and Sungjae Im here in particular in their course history, but also a very low round sample size, right? So these guys, Tommy's got 8 rounds, Sungjae's got 12, right? You can see that overall, Data Golf doesn't think that these are big reasons to boost these golfers, but based on what I am seeing from the SaberSim ownership projections, right, the Vegas odds themselves, and just overall general sentiment, I think they're going to be pretty chalky. So the last one I will mention, course fit. We didn't really have anybody that came up in the course fit research. But I'll also track overall sentiment. And this is a tough one to define. A lot of times I get this just from social media, Twitter, YouTube, right? There's a lot of kind of DFS chatter throughout the week as a golf tournament comes up. And a couple of the names, I guess part of the reason these names jumped out to me when we were doing this research, a couple of the names that I'm already seeing a lot this week is particularly Tommy and Sungjae, right? And those are the two names that looked a little bit low to me when I was looking at the overall ownership projections. So I will kind of do a little bit of research and then just make some adjustments to ownership projections overall and make sure that things are about in line of what I think is going to happen here. So I do think Tommy Fleetwood's going to be a little bit chalkier than we're projecting. I think Sungjae is probably going to be the preferred golfer at the top end. I didn't mention recent form, I don't think yet, but that's another one that I think is something that people key in on too much. With Neiman winning last week and pretty much just dominating last week, I think he's going to be a little bit more popular. And again, I'm not trying to nail this perfectly. My goal is to basically just say, what are the guys that are going to be popular for reasons that the ownership model might not pick up on? And these are the ownership inefficiencies that I end up ultimately wanting to exploit when I'm building my lineups. So that might be good for now here. Sometimes I'll also sort by salary and see if when I'm looking by salary band, if there's anybody else that jumps out. But I think that looks pretty good for now. So now typically what I will do, and again, this process will be a little bit more involved when I actually do this for my lineups, is I will now do the research build. So my research build that I like to do, just like for other sports, is I will turn ownership fade off. I will turn the sim variance all the way to 10 so that I can get single tournament simulations here for this particular event. And I will build 1,500 lineups. And what I want to do is I want to compare how often a golfer is in the optimal lineup versus what is their ownership projection. And the reason I like to do a little bit, sometimes I will do this first, but generally I like to do a little bit of analysis of the ownership projections first, and then I will run my research build and kind of determine where I think there are ownership inefficiencies. So we'll let this build for a second, and we'll see what we're getting out of this. But I think one thing you will notice is if you do this research build without adjusting ownership projections at all, you will generally find that there aren't as many leverage opportunities because, again, the ownership model is using the projections as an input, and a lot of times it's hard to find where there's going to be inefficient ownership based on the way that the ownership projections are made because they come from our projections, right? So now let's take a look at this here. And I like to look at this a couple different ways. I like to look at this from the standpoint of what are the golfers that have the overall highest raw percent chance to show up in the optimal lineup, right? And then what are our biggest leverage plays and stands, right? So a combination of a golfer that has a very high overall raw chance to be in the optimal lineup and looks like they're going to be inefficiently owned generally is a flag to me that that's somebody I want to be overweight on. So I might make some more notes here and kind of say overweight. And I like the idea of being overweight on Oosthuizen, right? And I also will have the golfers that I want to be underweight on, right? So I'm kind of using a combination here, again, of the exposure columns and the leverage column to come up with this here. So obviously, I guess kind of you could see the writing on the wall here that, you know, Tommy Fleetwood and Sungjae are probably going to be two of my biggest fades this week, right? But they also kind of pop up with this negative leverage here. So I like the idea of fading. And what I like to think about here when I'm kind of looking at this leverage build is treating the ownership as kind of somewhat flexible. So what I mean is basically this is saying that until Oosthuizen gets to about 17.5% owned, he is a positive leverage play. So I can ask myself, what do I think the ceiling of Oosthuizen's ownership is based on kind of where I think right now? And I think that's about reasonable, right? I think it's unlikely that he comes in owned much higher than this. That's just my take right now. Again, it's still kind of early in the week. Whereas Tommy Fleetwood is a negative leverage play unless his ownership is 17% or less. And I think he's definitely going to be more owned than that. Same thing with Sungjae, right? Sungjae is a negative leverage play as long as he is 14% owned or less, right? So I'll kind of come up with a list of where I want these golfers to be. And I won't do this necessarily for every single golfer in the field. I think similar to other sports, if you can come up with a list of 2 to 6 golfers that you're overall taking a stand on, I think that works fine. I mean, an interesting one, for example, here is Neiman, right? Who, I bumped up his ownership projection. I think he's going to be popular this week, but he's our most likely to be in the optimal golfer. And there's not that much leverage to get there, right? At least not at the moment. He is a negative leverage play until his ownership gets to about 18%. I don't know. I don't know exactly how I feel about that one. So you don't need to force it. You don't need to like go and try to dig up all these different golfers, right? But coming up with a list of a couple golfers you want to be on, a couple golfers that maybe you want to be off. And again, for me, this is entirely based on an ownership thing. I think is a good approach to add a little bit of value. So the last thing I will do here is, and I've gone back and forth on the way that I want to do this, but I will generally make some adjustments to my player pool overall to force the builder in a direction of giving me lineups that I think have high upside from a construction standpoint. And this is where, in general, my idea of sorting by make cut percent and figuring out a certain cutoff has come from, right? Basically, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to make sure that I don't have more than, 1 or 2 of these golfers here at the bottom range into a lineup that has, sometimes 3 golfers below 6K or 3 or more golfers that have below a 50% chance to make the cut. I think the overall raw scoring upside of that lineup comes down a bit. And I like to start doing some pruning of my player pool here. I have switched this up a little bit. I've experimented with some different things. So I think there's a couple different ways you can do this. I think the easiest, and I think kind of the way that I've used to have done this in the past, is figure out about where that last golfer in my pool is that I want. And maybe it's right around the 50% cut range, but typically there's a particular name that jumps out to me. And I will cut it there and just eliminate all the golfers below that. So in this particular case, this is a tough course. So I might be willing to accept a little bit of a lower make cut percentage in my lineups. One name that was popping when we were looking at the course history and the course fit on Data Golf was Brandon Hagee. That might be where I draw the line for this particular course, is around his average projection. And I can just eliminate this here and say all golfers below that average projection, I'm just going to eliminate, right? And that it doesn't cut it off perfectly, but it does a pretty good job of kind of approximating where that cutoff is. I think that's a decent way of doing this. Another way that I've been experimenting with is instead of having this really aggressive approach with the player pool, is to instead group these golfers with our new groups tool. So in rules, groups, and to create a group either based on, the salary or just, again, that average projection. And I'm not going to do this here because it's going to take a while, but to group all of these golfers below a certain point and say no more than one or something like that. So actually, it won't take too long. Let's just do this real quick. So we can take all of these golfers here and create a group. And I think it would be easier if there was a way to do this kind of automated. I think that's something that we maybe will add here in the future. But we can group these guys up. We'll just go to right there. That's fine. Oh, no, this is it. Yeah, okay. So, and you could go further. Again, you could keep grouping these guys up. Maybe it's every golfer under 7K, I think is another one that I've heard before that I think is interesting. But we can group these guys and just say less than or equal to 1. The main reason I've noticed, at least in my experimenting with the SaberSim builder, the main reason why I think this is kind of important is because these guys at the lower end of the projection range and the salary range have these much, much lower ownership projections. The higher you bump this ownership fade slider up, the more I think spending a little bit of time on your player pool and making sure you only have golfers, making sure that you only have golfers that you actually want to show up in your lineups in your pool is important. Because if you crank up this ownership fade slider, and you can see at 150 max, something like the mini max or some of these larger field tournaments, ownership fade comes to 4, it will start pushing these lower owned golfers into your pool. So the more your ownership fade slider comes up, the more I think it's worth making adjustments to your pool. But from here, then I will kind of just, let's build 150. From here, I will run my build, right? This is kind of my working build here, and then make some adjustments on the exposures. And I know there was a question about exposure adjustments in golf and MMA. So maybe this would be a good segue into that. So. And let me know if there's any questions here on this. I know I've been jumping all over the place, been talking about a few different things here. So hopefully I didn't go too quick over anything. I've been trying to kind of make this as helpful as possible without doing a super deep dive into the Honda Classic, because that's not really what I'm trying to do here. But if there's any questions about any of this, just let me know. Okay, so then the last step, right, is I want to kind of get the leverage on the plays that I want it to be on, right? So a lot of times I scale everything based on the actual ownership projection, right? And this is true of other sports as well. But especially for a higher variance sport like golf, I don't need to be, I don't feel like I ever really need to have 3x, 4x, 5x, the 5x the exposure than the field does on virtually anybody, right? No golfer projects generally that well. So for example, a guy that was on my list of somebody that just looks a little under-owned to me at the moment was Oosthuizen, right? I'm over the field on him right now, but I might bump this up to say 26%, maybe 30% to get a little bit of that positive leverage there. And then the names that were popping up as the fades were Sungjae, who I am almost fully fading anyway right now, right? I might just uncheck that. And Fleetwood was the other one. So I'm probably just fine with being about a third of the field on Fleetwood. If I'm feeling kind of aggressive, or if I don't have a lot of other players that I'm trying to get a stand on from an ownership standpoint, maybe I'll just uncheck, right? And then go in and see, what are my biggest plays on the slate? And again, I'm always kind of comparing. I'm thinking about this really from the standpoint of, where's the wiggle room on this ownership projection? A guy that, again, I think could be a little bit chalkier. And I think our ownership projections have been updating throughout the slate here, right? But a guy that I think could end up being a little bit more popular than our ownership projection suggests right now is Berger, right? So maybe this is a guy that I want to be a little bit more cautious with, right? I often don't want to be like 2x on any golfer that didn't really pop up on my individual list anyway. So I might bring these down a little bit here, because it wasn't like, Brooks and Horschel were guys that popped up in my research, right? I typically want my highest overall leverage play on a slate to be a golfer that I kind of intentionally arrived at, which at least for this demo was Oosthuizen and not Horschel or Brooks. So the other thing I'll check for is just kind of seeing, are there any plays like this where there's like some lower salary guy that projects for very low ownership that's ending up being like a top overall play on the slate for me. A lot of times I don't feel like I need this much exposure to these guys. I might bring this down a little bit, maybe even just to like 8%, right? These two as well, maybe. Just so it rarely is there a tournament where a 6K golfer is like one of my top 5 overall positive leverage plays, right? And I'll want to make sure that my biggest fades are kind of in line with the way I wanted to approach the slate. So yeah, again, Sungjae, Tommy, right? I'm fine fading Neiman with the recent form fade. I think is a good thing. Maybe someone like Matthew Wolff, right? This wasn't a play that I really kind of identified as somebody I really want to be intentionally under on. So maybe I boost his min exposure back up and get a little bit more exposure to him. So something like that. Overall, I would say I rarely am going into a slate for golf with more than 40 or 50% exposure, probably closer to 40% to any one golfer. These are actually a little bit lower than what my normal exposures would look like for a particular tournament. But I also don't think there's like a big home run golfer that I really want a ton of exposure to in this particular field. It's kind of a weaker field. I think it's overall kind of flatter projections with a tougher course. So maybe I'm kind of okay with this in general. But that is overall the approach. So, and these are the kind of lineups that I like to see coming out of this. We're getting a lot of low ownership on some of the plays in here, but it's not because we packed in a ton of under 7K super cheap golfers, right? I'm okay with, a little bit exposure to these lower salary guys. But that's kind of what that group is doing to help us out now. So, and I think if I finished that, if I went all the way, if I was actually building my final lineups here, I would have actually either finished off this group and actually made sure I got every single golfer I wanted only one max from in here, or just did a little bit more, right? Like maybe come back to something like this. What was it? What was Haggie's projection? So I don't know where he is now. Oh, there he is. 40. It was at 49. So maybe some kind of combination here of this. So, but hopefully that was helpful. Again, kind of the big, I guess, the core principles of what I typically do is I really pay attention to ownership, and I really make sure that the ownership projections are what I believe in, what I think is actually going to happen. I don't think you need to touch every single golfer in the field, but I think it can help if you can identify maybe the handful of golfers that you think are going to get 20, 25 plus ownership. I think it will help a ton. Then figure out where's the ownership inefficiencies overall. Maybe that's with a research build or some other process. For me, it's a research build. And then figure out I typically end up with a kind of a pool of golfers. I would say maybe closer to 3 to 8 that are my stance on the slate. And then coupled, I guess the last thing there is to make adjustments to the player pool with either the player filters or with just a group to make sure that you can kind of force your lineup constructions to go in a way where those lineups actually have upside, right? You don't get a ton of these lineups that have a lot of 6K golfers in it either way. But again, the higher that ownership fade slider comes up, and especially if you're up here or you want even more ownership fade, I think the better off you are going to be by doing some player pool pruning. So, but Good question. And let me know if that helps. And again, if there's any confusion there or any questions, happy to talk a little bit more about it. But I'm going to hit this one real quick. This question, this is from Matt. I think I kind of covered this a little bit here, but I want to answer this one explicitly. This question says, so similar to the one I love, I don't mind having 90 to 100% max exposure on a player in NBA just because they might be in a great spot, but that doesn't seem wise for PGA or MMA. Could you go over exposure strategies across different sports, baseball too, for whenever it starts? Yeah, so these high variance sports, a lot of times I'm kind of very plugged into the ownership projection as a tool for saying, how much exposure do I need to get positive leverage on this particular player? So again, I mentioned for golf, a lot of times, this is kind of just like a rule of thumb, I guess. A lot of times my maximum exposure for a given event that I'm willing to have is somewhere around 2x the highest overall projected owned golfer, right? So like I would probably be comfortable up to about 40%, 50% roughly for this particular event. It's around there generally, right? Again, it's from the kind of, I guess, the overall stance that I don't need to be 100% on a high variance individual golfer that at maximum is going to be owned like 20% of lineups, depending on that particular event, right? John Rahm, when he is in the field, is somebody that I am almost always over the field on. And, you know, if his projected ownership is 20, 25%, a lot of times my maximum overall exposure will be, you know, maybe 50% to any one golfer in the field. But a lot of times my individual leverage is about 2x that golfer's overall projected ownership. For MMA, let's go to MMA. Because there's just a much smaller field, a lot of times that means I am 100% on a particular fighter, right? Like, I don't know if these ownership projections are right at the moment. Maybe they are. They seem a little weird. Let's jump back to last week's card. Okay, so like this is a better example, right? Like if you want to get positive leverage on Dackhouse, right? He's 46% owned. You need to be well exposed to that particular fighter. That might be 100% exposure. So in MMA, I'm a little bit more willing just because there's such a smaller field, right? If there's only 24 fighters, you have to be very heavily invested into one fighter or the other. So I will be a little bit more exposed there. For baseball, since you mentioned it, baseball is interesting because pitchers and hitters have very different variance, right? Pitchers generally, let's pull up something here. While pitchers in general have a kind of a wide range of outcomes, their most common outcomes are centered around that average. So in general, my approach to playing pitchers or my exposure to pitchers for baseball is, I would say, somewhat similar to basketball. If there is a pitcher that is projected spectacularly well, I am generally pretty comfortable being well over the field on that particular pitcher. For hitters, though, right? We look at someone like Freddie Freeman, right? Freeman is projected for, or was projected on this random July slate for 10.74. You can tell his most common outcomes are mostly centered around 0, right? This average projection means very little. I'm generally not very interested. I don't feel like I need to go well over the field to get leverage on golfers. And in fact, if there's a golfer that's projected very highly, now I'm mixing things up. If there's a hitter that's projected very highly, from an ownership standpoint, I end up generally just fading or at most matching the field. On a typical, right? This isn't even a very typical one. I would say like, this is actually kind of a weird slate. Yeah, on like a 9-game MLB slate or something like that, right? A lot of times my overall highest exposure to any one hitter from an exposure standpoint will be about whatever the maximum projected ownership is for any one batter. So this is a little low. I might be about 20 to 30% exposed to any one batter at most on most baseball slates. again, these are all just rules of thumb. That's not a hard and fast rule. If the pitching sucks, for example, right, I might be very spread out on my pitchers and a little bit more condensed on my hitters and stacks. But in general, the higher the variance of the player's range of outcomes, right, or the less meaningful their average projection actually is, the less likely their most common outcomes are to be centered around their average projections, the more I will use ownership as a guidepost of how exposed I want to be to a particular player. And this is true in different sports as well, right? So even NASCAR, right? NASCAR is actually a good example too, because again, it's kind of in between golf and MMA in terms of field size, right? Where it's a high variance sport where average projections are kind of meaningless. But you have, do we have anything up for, I don't think we do yet. Yeah. Anyway, I think you get the point. You have, hang on. So I to get positive leverage on some of these best projected plays for Daytona, right? You need to be pretty aggressively exposed to these drivers, right? One of my favorite plays that didn't pan out at all for Daytona, but was a guy that just popped in my research build, a guy that I ended up having a lot of exposure to, was Alex Bowman, right? Well, how much exposure did I have? How much leverage did I need to get on him to be positively leveraged for this particular race? I think I had like 20%. So, right, it follows from the ownership projections. So, all right, cool. All right, cool. I'm going to just keep going. And this is an interesting question. This one is from Brendan here about the upcoming NBA slate. And I see you guys in YouTube chat. We'll get over to you guys in a second. I'm going to hit the rest of the questions in Slack first. But this one says, would you please review or explain why Jaden McDaniels might be negatively leveraged for 224-22 lineups, despite having a high value number? McDaniels' projected value is similar to that of Cameron Payne or Otto Porter, but each player has differing ownerships and exposures. Let me get this set up here. I understand ownership of one player necessitates not owning another, but please highlight any points I may have missed. Yeah, so this is, we'll give this one a shot. This is a little tricky here, mostly because, you know, the slate is 2 days away. We have initial projections up for this, but they will probably change heavily. And it's very easy for the ownership projections and the actual projections to get out of sync this early in the week. So I would not aggressively dial into either at the moment. But it said, okay, so it looks like this is a 0-0-10 build, and we're basically wondering why is one player a good play and the other one isn't, based on a research build. Let's look at this. So my gut feeling, again, without having looked at this really at all here, is that both players, both McDaniels and Otto Porter are good plays, and in one situation the ownership projection has caught up, and in the other situation it hasn't, is my best guess. But we'll take a look. Let me close some of this stuff up. Get a second to catch my breath here. Drink some water. All right. So let's see. So I think the question is why is one of these guys a negative leverage play and one isn't, right? Okay. So yeah, you can kind of see it, right? So positive leverage on one versus the other. I mean, again, I think this is hard because this is bordering very closely to explaining a player's projection, which is always the hardest question that I think can be asked of me here on the spot. My best guess for this overall is that the reason that Payne and Porter show up in far more optimals than Jalen McDaniels, despite having a similar point per dollar value, is because the raw projection of these two players is higher, right? And when This actually goes to kind of show why I like to do a little bit of player pool pruning of players projected for low raw points, is that even though McDaniels is giving you 6.43 fantasy points per dollar you spend on salary, he is only projected for 23.16, right? On a raw fantasy points projection, right? Even to score what Otto Porter's average projection is, would be a 26.39 divided by 36. 26.39 divided by 3,600 would be a 7.3x fantasy point outcome for Jaden McDaniels. And this, I guess, is actually kind of a very good segue into this other question you had, Brendan, here about value, right? So Brendan's follow-up question was, is there anything actionable when interpreting SaberSim value numbers for a given slate that doesn't require a deep knowledge about a player? I would actually say, like, my biggest thing I would say here is to be somewhat cautious of value, right? Ultimately, value is just the average projection for a player divided by their salary. So it is a function. It is a direct function of the average projection. So it has the same problems that average projections have in general. And while average projections in NBA are probably the most predictive of upside than any other sport, average projections in general are probably the most important in NBA compared to other sports, right? They still have problems of not being inherently predictive of upside. And I actually think this is like the perfect example of it. If you take the average projection of every single player on the slate and divide it by the salary to get the value numbers, right? And use that as a determination of figuring out what are the best overall plays on the slate, right? You wouldn't get situations like this where you have two players that have very similar, or even Aaron Gordon's a good example too, right? Two players that have virtually the exact same average point projection divided by salary, the exact same value, but one player shows up in the optimal lineup twice as often, right? Because part of the problem is that average projections alone don't do a good job of representing upside, right? This is actually kind of why, I guess, also why I like the research builds, period, is that they will help show you not only what players project well on average, but at their ceiling, which players are showing up in the optimal lineups most often. And what are the plays that the field is over or undervaluing because of that, right? Jaden McDaniels may very well be a player that come Thursday, the field very much overvalues because the perception is that he's a good play because he projects very well on average, but we can see he doesn't actually possess the upside to show up in optimal lineups very often. Now, you don't necessarily need optimal lineups to win DFS tournaments, especially in smaller size contests, but I think this is still a useful tool. So, I would look at value as only a way to kind of just get familiarized with a slate, get familiarized with what some of the good plays might be, what the field might perceive to be some of the good plays. But I would almost never make a strategic decision of who I wanted to play or if I wanted to be over or under the field on a particular player purely based on this number alone. I think this is mostly just useful for like figuring out what does this slate look like, right? What are the best plays? So what are the best, I guess I should say, what are the best average projected plays, right? Not necessarily maybe the best plays overall. The upside and ownership agnostic best plays on the slate is kind of what I think the value gives you. So, and then a question from Phantom here about NHL. He said, are you able to go over your NHL process basics, or is it still pretty much in tune with the video with Couch and Mr. Clean? It pretty much is. I haven't really added that much. That video, first of all, what Phantom is referring to is on our YouTube channel here. Under our NHL section here. This video, how to beat NHL DFS in 2021, now 2022. But Couch and Mr. Clean came on and gave me some tips on the NHL side of things. I'm still relying pretty heavily with what they taught me. I, especially on bigger slates, I would say maybe 5 or 6 games or more. I like that. I like using that stack rule here. Of 3 players from the same even strength lines. in both lineups, right? I am also pretty cautious with my exposures in hockey, right? I think virtually everybody that hits the ice in hockey is pretty high variance. So I will be pretty cautious and try to not be too overexposed to anyone, really skater or goalie in my particular build. I think research builds there was a question somebody asked me recently if research builds were a good idea in hockey. I think they definitely can be. I think it's a high variance sport where there's not going to be a big late swap risk. So I think spending the time to do that research up front is pretty interesting. I also think, you can kind of just ballpark it a little bit with figuring out where ownership is going to be inefficient by just looking at what are the best overall projected lines. So I've been using this NHL Vegas dashboard on Fantasy Labs. I use this for baseball too. I've talked about this a little bit in baseball season, but just get an idea of like what's the field going to do, right? What is the perception of overall what the best projected lines are and the worst projected lines are, and same thing with goalies, right? And just kind of be on the other side of that. Zig where they zag, essentially, especially in the larger field stuff. So I will almost certainly, it is very unlikely that I am over the field on either Toronto or Florida tonight, just by this alone. I can already tell you that, right? Because I am, Toronto is the highest overall projected team, right? And let's say the Islanders are let's use Anaheim, right? Anaheim is the 5th overall projected team. There's a goal difference in their implied total, right? The individual variance of a single goal in hockey is so high that I am overwhelmingly confident that the field will overvalue this difference, probably pretty significantly. So I haven't built lineups for tonight. I can't guarantee exactly what I'm going to do, but take a pretty game theory focused approach to my builds. So I'm curious what we're getting out of this. So actually a ton of Nashville, right? Which is kind of interesting. I will probably cool this off a little bit. These are pretty high exposures. This is only 20 lineups. I've been playing closer to 150. So I would probably do a 150 and a 1500 lineup build. I would probably relax some of my exposure here. But for the most part, I have been still kind of sticking pretty heavily with a lot of the principles that we talked about in this video. So cool. All right, let's jump over to YouTube chat here. Champ said, I need that SaberSim pullover. I'll buy it. I need it in XL. It is only available if you win the winner's circle. So, and we like it that way. I think it makes it all that much sweeter when you win one. It makes the items themselves feel a little bit more valuable. So on our site, there's a link at the top for the winner's circle. It'll give you kind of the rules of how to get some of this stuff here. But basically, you wear the SaberSim logo on DraftKings or FanDuel, and then based on the size of your win, top 5 finish of $1,000 or more, we'll send you some gear. So the hoodie starts at 10K prize pools. So Josh said, no college basketball on SaberSim. Great 12-game slate today on DK. It is on our list. We recently brought Eric onto our team, and he is a bit of a college basketball expert. It is on our list to develop a college basketball sim and model. We have a couple others. We obviously had the NASCAR sim come out this past week. We have some other sports that are ahead of college basketball, mostly because of the timing of the year, right? I know March Madness is coming up. A lot of excitement about college basketball for March Madness, but then that kind of is the end of the season. So I think at this point, it's probably a little bit more likely that we'll have it for next season, most likely. But Chuck says, do you mind sharing what percentage of your projections do you change? Because it seems to me changing too many projections undermines the trust of SaberSim. I don't edit projections very much, if at all, across a lot of different sports. I would say in particular, for the first, I would say actually the only sports that I would say I'm ever really inclined to edit projections will be golf and MMA. And it's not so much even about saying I want to edit the projection because I think the projection is wrong. It will be just because it's another way for me to kind of leverage against the field, right? Like average projections to me mean the least in sports like golf and MMA compared to other sports. So I'm a little bit more willing to just, if I don't want a particular player, I will bump their projection down. And if I want more of them, I'll be more willing to bump their projection up. In the other kind of primary sports, football, baseball, basketball, I'm pretty trusting of the projections overall, and I'm more interested in getting an edge from the standpoint of finding a game theory angle or finding an ownership inefficiency than I am from trying to find a situation where a player is just misprojected. That's my overall stance. If you're interested, again, I plug this video pretty often, but if you're interested in watching the perspective of a player that plays very differently than me, I would check out on our NBA course, this video from Max, How to Beat Daily Fantasy Basketball Like an NBA DFS Pro. Max is very focused on adjusting projections and fine-tuning projections, at least for NBA in particular. I think it's a different way to get an edge, and he'll edit projections for, half the players in the pool at times, depending on, where things kind of stand. So, but I don't make a lot of adjustments to projections. Cody said, "Hey, Jordan, hope things are going well." They are. Hope things are going well with you too. Deshaun said, "Will there be a way to add review mode to sports like esports, PGA, MMA, NASCAR in the future? I know Fantasy Cruncher has it, but would rather stick with SaberSim review mode process." Yeah, there definitely is a plan for that. I am a little bit surprised that we don't have some of that up. We have a provider that we work with that does our actual scores. So I think maybe we just need to see if they have actual scores for those sports. But yeah, definitely something that we would want to have. Ryan says, any plans to add player stats to other sports like with the big three? Let's see. I believe so. Yeah, so not a lot for MMA. Do we have it for NASCAR? We do. So we do kind of have it for NASCAR, right? Fastest laps, finish position, place differential, laps led, fastest laps, right? Along with the percentiles. I think the goal is to have the detailed projections up for every sport we have sims for. We recently put out a update we recently put out League of Legends Sims. And I think our plan is to update the app with the detailed projections for League of Legends. When we convert MMA over to simulations as well, I think the goal would be to put some detailed projections up for MMA as well. Yeah, definitely something we would like to do. So Eric says, is there a way in Saber that I can select what line I want to play in NHL? Say if I want to play Florida 1, let's see. Okay, so there's a couple ways to do this. Let me see if we can do. Okay, so we don't have a pure filter based on just the line. So, the first thing you can do here is, I think, or maybe one of the easiest things you could do is if you know what line you want to play just right off the bat, you can just, specify, what team, right? Like assuming you want 100% exposure to this particular team, right? You could just do this and say, only give me lineups using Florida, 3 players from the same Florida even strength line. And then in step 3, adjust your exposures to match that. I think the other option is to do this with editing, like set a broader stack rule like I did for this particular build, and then adjust your exposures to particular lines here. So like, for example, some combination of, so you can identify what teams you want to stack here, right? So maybe you don't want to play San Jose, right? Or I actually think I'm kind of interested in fading Florida. So if I wanted to fade Florida, you could do that. And then also editing individual player exposures. I actually will do a little bit of this and see what exposure I'm getting to of players on third or fourth lines, right? And maybe you just want to remove some of these guys. So again, if you are certain of the exact line that you want to play, right, before even building lineups, I think you can set a rule here that targets that exact team. Otherwise, I think it's easy to do in the exposures here. Matt says, yeah, that would be a great feature add to be able to filter players by line on either step 1 or within step 2. Yeah, I think I agree. I think that would be helpful. It kind of almost seems like having the ability to just say what lines would be allowed here might be useful, but maybe it's more helpful as a player filter. So, but cool. All right. We are right at about an hour. So we'll go ahead. I think I've gotten through pretty much everything here today. So we'll go ahead. We'll cap it off there. Thank you to everybody that tuned in today, asked questions, participated. Big thank you to everybody that listens to the show after the fact as the recording on YouTube. We'll be right back here again tomorrow. Same time, same place, 2 p.m. Eastern. Look forward before the end of the week. We are planning on doing a model stream for NASCAR, where I'll have Matt and maybe some of the guys that worked on the NASCAR model come on and talk a little bit about how our NASCAR sims work, the factors that go into that. So excited about that. Look forward to that before the end of the week. But until then, thanks. Good luck in tonight's NHL slate. If you're playing hockey tonight, I think it is the biggest slate of the year that I've seen so far. Some really big tournaments. So good luck tonight, and I will see you guys tomorrow. All right. See ya.